What's your name, son?
Elijah.
Elijah, who's your father?
You need to leave, Mr. Coleman.
Why?
Because 3 years ago, you never came looking for us.
Us?
Mom, why does that man look like—
Franklin Coleman was worth $11 billion, and none of it mattered the moment he saw a 7-year-old boy's eyes staring back at him from across his son's grave. Because those eyes were not supposed to exist anymore. His son had been dead for 3 years. And yet here was a child, kneeling in the cold grass beside a stranger, blinking up at him with the exact same gaze that used to look at him across a dinner table before everything fell apart. What happened next would not just change Franklin's life. It would unravel a lie that had been protected for years by the one man he trusted the most in this world. Stay with me, because before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The cemetery sat on a quiet hill outside a small town in upstate New York, the kind of place where the wind never seemed to stop moving through the trees, even on days when the rest of the world felt still. It was early November, and the sky had turned that flat, colorless gray that comes right before the first real snow of the season. The grass had gone brittle. The trees stood bare, their branches shaking slightly with every gust, as if even they were cold. And there, walking alone up the gravel path that curved between rows of headstones, was a man most people in America would recognize instantly if he weren't wearing an old wool coat that looked far too thin for the weather. Franklin Coleman did not dress like a billionaire on Sundays. He wore the same coat he had worn for years, a coat Diane, his late wife, had once teased him about, because it made him look like a retired schoolteacher instead of the founder of one of the largest logistics companies in the country. He never bothered to buy a new one. Some habits from grief do not make sense to anyone but the person carrying them. He had forgotten, again, that November in this part of New York bit harder than the city ever did, and the wind cut straight through the fabric as he walked, but he barely seemed to notice. His mind was somewhere else entirely, the way it always was on these visits. He stopped in front of a headstone near the top of the hill, one that had been there for 3 years now, though it still looked strangely new to him every single time. The name carved into the stone read David Coleman. Beneath it, in smaller letters, was an epitaph Franklin had written himself the week after the funeral, when he could barely hold a pen steady enough to sign his own name. It read simply, "A man who tried to love people the right way." He had chosen those words carefully, because they were the truest thing he could say about his son, and because he knew, deep down, that he had not always managed to do the same. He came here every Sunday. Rain, snow, heat, it did not matter. The groundskeeper, an older man named Walter who had worked these grounds for over 20 years, recognized Franklin's black car the moment it pulled through the gates each week, and always kept his distance, offering only a small nod from wherever he happened to be raking leaves or repairing a fence. Whether that distance came from respect for a grieving father or quiet intimidation toward a man whose name appeared on business headlines across the country, Walter himself probably could not have said. Franklin never seemed to expect conversation from anyone here, and in a strange way, that suited him just fine. He stood in front of the grave for a long while, hands in his coat pockets, saying nothing out loud, though his lips moved faintly now and then, the way people do when grief has taught them to talk to someone who can no longer answer. At one point, he pulled out his phone out of pure habit, thumb hovering over the screen, though there was nothing waiting for him there. No missed calls from old friends. No messages from anyone who wasn't paid to reach him, whether through a salary, a contract, or an email chain tied to quarterly earnings. He put the phone away just as quickly as he had taken it out, almost embarrassed at himself for checking. It was in that stillness, in that quiet, private moment of a man standing utterly alone with his grief, that something shifted the air entirely. From somewhere behind a row of hedges near the eastern edge of the cemetery, a sound broke through the wind. A child's laughter, sudden and bright, completely out of place among the stone markers and bare branches. Franklin's head lifted immediately, almost on instinct, the way a parent's head turns toward a sound their body recognizes before their mind has time to process why. He turned and saw them 3 rows over, near a smaller, older section of the cemetery. A woman knelt in front of a headstone, her coat pulled tight against the cold, and beside her stood a small boy, maybe 6 or 7 years old, bundled in a red jacket that seemed slightly too big for his frame. The boy had been chasing something, a leaf perhaps, or simply his own laughter, and when he noticed a stranger watching him from a distance, he stopped mid-stride and looked up directly at Franklin. For a moment, Franklin could not move, could not breathe properly. The boy's eyes lifted toward him with open, unguarded curiosity, the kind only children seem capable of, and in that instant, something in Franklin's chest went completely still. Those eyes, that exact shade of brown, almost amber when the light hit them right. That same narrow, thoughtful way they crinkled slightly at the outer corners whenever something caught his attention. He had seen those eyes every single day for 26 years. He had watched them light up at graduations, soften during quiet conversations, and finally close for the last time in a hospital room that still visited him in his sleep more nights than he cared to admit. Franklin did not approach. He told himself later that his legs simply would not move, though the truth was more complicated than that. Some part of him was afraid that if he took even a single step closer, whatever strange, impossible thing his mind was trying to process would either dissolve completely or become undeniably real, and he was not certain which possibility frightened him more. So he stood there instead, watching from a distance as the woman gently took the boy's hand, said something too quiet for Franklin to hear, and led him back toward a modest car parked along the cemetery's narrow road. He watched the car pull away slowly down the gravel path, watched it disappear past the iron gates and onto the main road, and still he did not move. Long after the sound of the engine had faded into the wind, Franklin remained standing exactly where he was, staring at the empty patch of grass where the boy had been just minutes before, as though the space itself might somehow explain what he had just witnessed. Questions began forming in his mind faster than he could organize them, each one more unsettling than the last, each one circling back to the same impossible thought he could not yet allow himself to fully believe. It was Walter, the groundskeeper, who finally noticed him standing there far longer than usual, coat barely holding against the wind, face pale in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. He approached carefully, the way one might approach a man standing too close to the edge of something, and asked if Franklin was all right. Franklin did not answer that question. Instead, in a voice his own employees would not have recognized, a voice stripped of every ounce of the composure he had spent decades building in boardrooms and negotiations, he asked Walter a single question. He wanted to know who that woman was. And more than that, though he could barely bring himself to say it out loud, he wanted to know who that little boy was, and why. God help him. He could not stop thinking about his eyes. Walter did not have an answer for him, not really. He explained, somewhat hesitantly, that the woman had been visiting that particular grave for as long as he could remember working these grounds, arriving every few weeks with the boy in tow, always quiet, always keeping to herself, never lingering long enough for anyone to strike up a conversation. He said he had never learned her name, only that she seemed to carry the kind of quiet exhaustion he had seen in a lot of visitors over the years, the kind that comes from carrying grief alone for a long time. Franklin listened to every word carefully, filing each detail away, though none of it answered the question pressing hardest against his chest. He thanked Walter, climbed into his car, and sat there in the parking lot for nearly 20 minutes before he trusted himself enough to drive. By the time Franklin returned to his penthouse that evening, the sun had already disappeared behind the skyline, and the apartment greeted him the way it always did, spotless, silent, and entirely too large for one man. He poured himself a drink he did not touch and sat by the window for a long while, replaying the boy's face over and over in his mind, trying to convince himself it was simply a trick of grief, the kind of cruel coincidence that happens when a person spends 3 years staring at a headstone every Sunday. But the harder he tried to talk himself out of it, the more clearly he remembered the exact shape of those eyes, and by midnight, he had made a decision he had not made in years. He picked up his phone and placed a call to someone who knew how to find answers quietly. The woman he called was not someone from his usual circle of lawyers and executives. Her name was Sarah Okafor, a retired detective who had spent over 20 years working cases in the city before starting her own private investigation practice. The kind of work that required patience most people in Franklin's world had long since lost. He had used her services once before, years earlier, for a matter he never discussed with anyone, and she had proven herself discreet in a way that mattered more to him than her rates ever could. When she answered the phone that night, her voice carried the rough edge of someone recently woken from sleep, but she did not complain. She simply asked what he needed, the same way she always did, without wasting time on pleasantries neither of them cared for. Franklin found himself struggling to explain what he wanted, which was unusual for a man who had spent decades giving orders with absolute clarity. He told her about the cemetery, about the woman kneeling at a grave 3 rows from his son's, about the boy whose laughter had stopped him cold. He heard how strange it sounded even as the words left his mouth. A billionaire asking a private investigator to track down a stranger because of a resemblance he could not fully explain. Sarah did not laugh, and she did not question him the way anyone else might have. She simply asked him where the cemetery was located, what the woman looked like, and roughly how old the boy appeared to be. He answered every question slowly, deliberately, as though speaking too quickly might make the memory slip away from him entirely. Before ending the call, Sarah asked him one more thing, the same question any good investigator would ask before agreeing to dig into someone's private life. She wanted to know why this mattered so much to him, why a stranger's face at a cemetery had rattled a man known throughout the business world for his composure. Franklin was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the city lights scattered below his window, before he finally admitted the truth he had been avoiding since the moment he saw the boy's eyes. He told her he was not entirely sure yet, but something about that child felt like more than coincidence, and he needed to know the truth before the feeling ate him alive. Sarah agreed to start first thing in the morning, though neither of them could have predicted how deep that simple request would eventually pull them both. Sleep did not come easily to Franklin that night, and when it finally did, it pulled him back through years he usually kept locked away. He found himself dreaming of a small apartment on the edge of the city, decades earlier, back when his hands were still rough from warehouse work and his bank account rarely climbed above a few $100s. Diane, his wife, then only 24 years old, sat across a wobbly kitchen table lit by a single overhead bulb, laughing as they counted loose change to see if they could afford groceries for the week. She had been pregnant with David at the time, her hand resting on her stomach every so often without her even realizing it, and Franklin remembered thinking, even in the middle of that struggle, that he had never wanted anything as badly as he wanted to give that unborn child a better life than his own. He woke before sunrise, the dream still clinging to him uncomfortably, and found himself standing in his kitchen staring at marble countertops that had cost more than his first 3 years of salary combined. The irony was not lost on him. He had built exactly the life he once dreamed of at that wobbly table, and yet the house around him now felt colder than that cramped apartment ever had. His staff arrived at 8 sharp, as they always did, greeting him with polite efficiency rather than warmth, discussing his schedule rather than his well-being. It was an arrangement he had built for himself over the years, whether he had meant to or not, and this particular morning, the silence of it weighed on him more than usual. His daughter Patricia arrived just after 9, dressed sharply for a Sunday, carrying a leather folder Franklin recognized immediately as expansion paperwork for Coleman Aerospace Logistics. She did not bother with much small talk, having learned long ago that her father preferred conversations that moved directly toward their point. She explained that the board wanted his signature on a series of contracts by the end of the month, contracts she herself had spent the better part of a year negotiating. Franklin listened, nodded occasionally, and signed where she indicated, though his attention kept drifting elsewhere. Patricia noticed, the way she always noticed when her father's mind wandered somewhere she was not invited, and something in her expression tightened, an old, familiar frustration resurfacing without either of them saying a word about it directly. Before leaving, Patricia mentioned, almost carefully, that she had been running daily operations largely on her own for the past 3 years, ever since David's passing had pulled Franklin further into himself than she had ever seen him retreat before. She did not say it with resentment exactly, though the weight of 3 years unacknowledged sat clearly beneath her words. Franklin barely looked up from his coffee, murmuring something about trusting her judgment completely, which was true, though it was not quite the acknowledgement she had been hoping for. She left shortly after, the door closing a little more firmly than necessary, and Franklin sat alone once again in a house that felt far too large for the silence it held. Later that afternoon, unable to focus on anything resembling work, Franklin found himself pulled back into memory once more, this time to a dinner several years before David's death, back when his son had still been full of plans for the future. David had arrived that evening nervous in a way Franklin had rarely seen him, fidgeting with his napkin before finally announcing he intended to marry a young woman he had been seeing for over a year, a home health aide named Maya, who worked long hours caring for elderly patients across the city. Franklin remembered his own response now with a discomfort that had only grown sharper with time. He had asked, more bluntly than he should have, whether she understood the kind of life she would be marrying into, whether her background aligned with what Franklin considered the family's trajectory. David's expression had shifted that night, something quiet and disappointed passing behind his eyes, though he had not argued the point loudly. He had simply told his father that Maya understood exactly what kind of life she was choosing, and that her background had nothing to do with her character, which mattered far more to him than any trajectory Franklin cared about. Franklin remembered staying silent after that, neither agreeing nor apologizing, the kind of silence that men in his position often mistook for wisdom rather than the quiet stubbornness it usually was. Looking back on it now, sitting alone in his penthouse with a stranger's son's eyes still burning in his memory, that old conversation felt less like caution and more like the first small betrayal in a story he was only beginning to understand. 3 days passed before Sarah called him back, and in that time, Franklin found himself unable to concentrate on anything that once consumed his attention without effort. Meetings that would have normally held his full focus now passed in a blur, his mind circling back again and again to that small boy's face. When his phone finally rang on a quiet Wednesday evening, he answered before the second ring had even finished, his usual composure nowhere to be found. Sarah did not waste time with pleasantries. She told him she had identified the woman, a 34-year-old named Maya Coleman, still carrying the Coleman name, though no legal marriage record existed between her and Franklin's late son beyond an engagement that had never reached the courthouse in time. The boy, she confirmed, was 7 years old, named Elijah, and according to birth records, he had been born almost exactly 8 months after David's death. Franklin sat frozen on the other end of the line, doing the math in his head, even as Sarah continued speaking, the timeline settling over him with a weight he was not prepared for. If the numbers held, and Sarah assured him she had checked them twice, Elijah had been conceived in the final weeks of David's life. Franklin's hand tightened around the phone as the full implications set in. This was not simply a boy who resembled his son by some strange trick of coincidence. This was very likely his own grandson, a child who had existed for 7 years without Franklin knowing anything about him, without ever once being told he had a family beyond the woman raising him alone in Queens. Sarah's investigation had uncovered something else, something that struck Franklin harder than the discovery of Elijah's existence itself. Buried within old legal correspondence tied to the Coleman family's law firm, she had found 2 separate letters from Maya, sent within the first year after David's death, attempting to reach the family. Both letters had been received, logged, and quietly dismissed, not by Franklin's office, but by Reginald Keynes, without ever reaching Franklin's desk or his knowledge at all. Franklin sat in stunned silence for a long moment after Sarah finished explaining what she had found. Reginald Keynes had been his business partner for over 25 years, a man he trusted with decisions worth hundreds of millions of dollars, a man who had stood beside him at David's funeral with what Franklin had believed at the time was genuine grief. The idea that Keynes had intercepted attempts from his own grandson's mother, without ever mentioning a word of it, felt almost impossible to accept, and yet the document Sarah described left little room for another explanation. The following morning, Franklin arrived unannounced at Coleman Aerospace Logistics headquarters, taking the private elevator directly to Keynes' office on the top floor, a glass corner space overlooking the entire city skyline. Keynes looked up from his desk with his usual easy smile, the same smile he had worn through decades of negotiations and handshakes, though something in Franklin's expression made that smile falter slightly before he had even said a word. Franklin closed the door behind him and asked, without any preamble, why Maya Coleman's letters had never reached him. Keynes' explanation came quickly, almost too quickly, delivered with the practiced calm of a man accustomed to smoothing over difficult conversations. He told Franklin that in the chaotic months following David's death, dozens of people had come forward claiming ties to the family fortune, distant relatives, old acquaintances, strangers looking to exploit a grieving father during his most vulnerable moment. He said he had made the decision to filter those approaches himself, purely to protect Franklin from being taken advantage of while he was in no condition to evaluate every claim personally. It sounded reasonable, delivered in Keynes' calm, measured tone, the kind of explanation that had worked on Franklin many times before over the years. As Keynes spoke, his eyes drifted briefly toward a locked drawer built into the side of his desk, lingering there for just a fraction of a second longer than the conversation required before he caught himself and looked back up at Franklin. It was a small thing, the kind of detail most people would never notice, but Franklin, still too stunned by everything else he had just learned, did not catch its significance in that moment either. He simply nodded slowly, still trying to reconcile Keynes' explanation with the 2 letters Sarah had found, unable yet to fully separate decades of trust from the doubt, now creeping quietly into his chest. Franklin told Keynes, in a tone that left no room for negotiation, that he intended to meet Maya and Elijah himself, without lawyers, without company representatives, without anyone standing between him and the family he had just discovered he still had. Keynes' smile returned almost instantly, reassuring him that of course, that was entirely his right, that he only ever wanted to protect him. Franklin left the office moments later, still unsettled but choosing, for now, to believe the man who had stood beside him through every major triumph and tragedy of the last 25 years. What Franklin did not see, as the elevator doors closed behind him, was Keynes returning to his desk the moment he was alone, picking up his phone, and dialing a number he had not used in months. His voice, when he finally spoke, had lost every trace of the calm reassurance he had just offered Franklin moments earlier. He said only a handful of words to whoever answered on the other end, quiet and urgent, that Franklin was getting close to finding out everything, and that they needed to move faster than they had originally planned. Franklin spent the rest of that week trying to prepare himself for a conversation he had no real framework for, having never once in his life needed to introduce himself to a grandson he did not know existed. He asked Sarah for the address in Queens, a modest apartment building nothing like the properties he typically visited, and told his driver he would be going alone, no assistants, no lawyers, nothing that might make Maya feel as though she were being approached by a corporation rather than a grieving father trying to make sense of what he had lost and what he might still have left. The building sat on a quiet residential street lined with older brick homes, nothing extravagant, but well kept in a way that suggested pride rather than resources. Franklin climbed the narrow staircase to the second floor, his heart pounding in a way it had not in years, and knocked on a door with a small wreath still hanging from a previous holiday season. When Maya opened it, her expression shifted the moment she recognized him, hardening almost instantly into something Franklin immediately understood as years of accumulated resentment finally finding its target. She did not invite him in right away, standing instead in the doorway with her arms crossed, studying him the way someone studies an old wound they thought had finally healed. She told him, without softening a single word, that she had reached out to his family twice after David's death, desperate and terrified and completely alone, and had been met with nothing but silence both times. She said she had spent 7 years raising Elijah by herself, working double shifts as a home health aide, piecing together a life for her son with no help from the family that shared his blood, and that somewhere along the way, she had simply stopped waiting for the Colemans to care. Her voice never rose into anger exactly, which somehow made it harder for Franklin to bear. It was exhaustion more than fury, the flat honesty of someone who had run out of energy for outrage years ago. She told him David used to defend him constantly, even in their private conversations, insisting his father loved in a complicated, broken sort of way, but loved nonetheless. She said she had held on to that belief for a long time after David died, waiting for some sign it might be true, until the silence finally convinced her otherwise. It was in the middle of that conversation that Elijah appeared in the doorway behind his mother, curious about the strangers standing on their front steps. Franklin's chest tightened at the sight of him up close for the first time, those same eyes studying him openly, without any of the guarded suspicion adults tend to develop over time. Franklin knelt down slowly to meet him at eye level, something he could not remember doing for another child in decades, and for a moment, neither of them said anything at all. Elijah broke the silence first, tilting his head slightly the way children do when they are working through a question that adults usually avoid asking directly. He asked Franklin, plainly and without any hesitation, if he was the grandfather his mom always said did not want them around. The words landed with a force Franklin had not braced himself for, unfiltered in the particular way only a child can manage, saying out loud the exact thing every adult in the conversation had been too careful to state so bluntly. Franklin did not have an answer ready, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he found himself entirely without words. He stayed nearly an hour that afternoon, sitting at Maya's small kitchen table while Elijah showed him a drawing he had made of a rocket ship, chattering easily now that the initial tension had softened slightly. Franklin found himself laughing for the first time in longer than he could recall, a genuine, unguarded sound that surprised even him. By the time he left, something fragile but real had begun forming between them, and Maya, though still cautious, allowed herself a small measure of hope she had not felt in years. That fragile progress did not survive the following morning. Franklin received a call from Sarah just after sunrise, her voice carrying an urgency that immediately put him on edge. She told him Maya had contacted her the night before in a panic, having just received an eviction notice from her building's new management company, effective within 30 days, with no clear explanation given for the sudden change. Sarah had spent the early hours digging through property records, and what she found stopped Franklin cold. The building had been quietly purchased 2 months earlier by a shell company, and after tracing the ownership through 3 separate layers of paperwork designed specifically to obscure it, the trail led directly back to Reginald Kane. The timing was impossible to ignore. 2 months earlier was almost exactly when Sarah's investigation had first begun asking questions on Franklin's behalf. Whoever wanted Maya and Elijah gone had moved quickly and quietly, using enough legal distance to avoid suspicion under normal circumstances. Franklin sat with the phone pressed to his ear, the warmth of the previous afternoon's laughter still fresh in his memory, now colliding directly with the cold realization that whatever threat existed around his newfound family was not buried safely in the past. It was active, it was deliberate, and it was close enough to reach the two people he had only just begun to let back into his life. Franklin did not sleep that night either, replaying the conversation with Sarah over and over, trying to reconcile the man he had known for 25 years with the pattern of quiet cruelty now surfacing around him. He called Sarah back before sunrise and told her to keep digging, no matter what it cost, no matter how deep she had to go into Kane's records to find the truth. She warned him, carefully, that some truths, once uncovered, could not be put back the way they were found. Franklin told her he understood, though he would soon discover he had no real idea what those words would eventually mean. For several days afterward, Franklin found himself caught in a strange, suspended kind of waiting, unable to act and unable to stop thinking. He canceled meetings he would never have canceled a month earlier, sat for long stretches in his study doing nothing at all, and twice found himself dialing Kane's number out of pure decades-old habit before catching himself and setting the phone down. Every fond memory he tried to summon of his old partner now arrived tangled with suspicion, and every act of suspicion arrived tangled with guilt, because some stubborn part of him still wanted the man to be innocent, still wanted to believe 25 years of friendship could not have been built entirely on a lie. It took Sarah nearly a week to find what she was looking for, working quietly through contacts she still had from her years on the force, careful not to alert anyone at Coleman Aerospace Logistics to what she was pulling. What she eventually uncovered had nothing to do with eviction notices or shell companies. It had to do with the night David died. Sarah had requested the original insurance claim filed after the accident, a routine document that had been settled quietly and quickly at the time, and buried within its supporting files was a piece of traffic camera footage that had never been mentioned publicly, not in the police report, not in the settlement, not anywhere. The footage showed a second vehicle on the road that night, one that had not been part of the official account of the accident at all. It appeared alongside David's car in the moments before the crash, positioned in a way that suggested it had forced him off the road rather than simply happening to be nearby. Sarah traced the vehicle's registration through several layers of corporate ownership before it finally led to a logistics contractor, one that did business almost exclusively with Kane's division of the company, a detail that could not be dismissed as coincidence given everything else Sarah had already uncovered. Franklin listened to all of this, sitting perfectly still in his study, the phone gripped tightly in his hand, feeling something inside him break apart in a way grief alone had never managed to do. His son's death had never been a simple accident. Someone had orchestrated it, and the trail of evidence, however carefully hidden, pointed toward the one man Franklin had trusted without question for over 2 decades. He asked Sarah, his voice barely above a whisper, if she was certain, and she told him she would not have called if she were not. That night, Franklin drove back to the cemetery alone, well past the hour visitors were usually permitted, and stood once more in front of David's headstone under a sky full of stars he barely noticed. He spoke aloud for the first time in 3 years, quietly apologizing to his son for every year he had spent assuming the accident was simply cruel misfortune rather than something someone had chosen to do. He told David he intended to find out the whole truth, no matter the cost to the company or to the name they shared, and standing there in the dark and the cold, he finally allowed himself to weep the way he had not permitted himself to at the funeral. The decision facing Franklin now was more complicated than simple grief or anger could resolve. Exposing Kane immediately, based on what they currently had, risked destroying a company that employed thousands of people, a company Patricia had spent 3 years building into something stable and profitable despite her father's emotional absence. But moving carefully, gathering airtight proof before making any accusation, risked giving Kane time to notice the investigation closing in and disappear entirely, taking the truth about David's death with him before anyone could hold him accountable for it. It was Patricia who forced the issue into the open days later, having noticed Sarah quietly requesting old company records that had nothing to do with any current project. She confronted her father directly, demanding to know what exactly he and this private investigator were digging into behind her back. Franklin, exhausted from carrying the weight of it alone, finally told her everything. The letters, the eviction, the traffic footage, all of it. He expected disbelief. What he saw instead on his daughter's face was something closer to recognition, slow and sickening, settling over her features as pieces of her own experience finally clicked into place. Patricia admitted, quietly, that she had noticed irregularities within Kane's division for well over a year, numbers that never quite balanced the way they should have, contracts routed through unfamiliar subsidiaries she had never been given clear explanations for. She had raised concerns twice in board meetings and been gently redirected both times, ultimately convincing herself she had simply misunderstood the complexity of the accounts. Hearing her father's account now, alongside her own suppressed suspicions, something between them shifted for the first time in years. Father and daughter, distant for so long, found themselves suddenly bound together by the same betrayal, working toward the same uncertain truth. As if the weight of exposing Kane were not enough on its own, Maya called Franklin that same week with news that struck him even harder given everything else unfolding around him. She told him, her voice steady but final, that she had decided to leave the city entirely, taking Elijah somewhere quiet, somewhere far removed from whatever turmoil had begun stirring around the Coleman name since Franklin's return into their lives. She said she loved that David had wanted his family reconciled, but she could not keep exposing her son to instability, not after everything they had already survived alone. Franklin drove to Queens that same evening, arriving unannounced once more, and asked Maya for exactly one thing before she made any final decision. He asked her not to trust his words, since words had clearly failed her before, but to give him a short window of time to prove through action what he could not yet prove through promises alone. Maya studied him for a long moment on her doorstep, arms crossed against the evening chill, before finally agreeing, though she made it clear the window would not stay open forever. Franklin found himself now racing against two separate clocks that refused to slow down for him. He needed to expose Kane before the man realized how close the investigation had gotten and vanished along with every answer Franklin still needed about his son's death. At the same time, he needed to convince Maya to stay, to trust him this time in a way she had never been given reason to trust the Colemans before. That night, standing alone in his penthouse long after the city lights had dimmed, Franklin called Sarah one final time before attempting sleep, admitting quietly, for the first time since this entire nightmare began, that he genuinely did not know if he could save both of them in time. The days that followed tested Franklin in ways his decades of business experience had never prepared him for. He split his time between Sarah's cramped office downtown, poring over documents that grew more damning by the hour, and Maya's apartment in Queens, where he showed up not with lawyers or arguments, but simply with his presence, trying to prove through consistency what words alone could not. He did not push her to stay. He only asked for time, promising her that whatever was happening around the Coleman name, she and Elijah would never again be left to face it alone the way she had been forced to for 7 long years. It was during one of these visits to Sarah's office that a knock came at the door late in the evening, unexpected and hesitant, the kind of knock that immediately put both of them on alert. Standing in the hallway was a woman Franklin did not recognize, nervous, clutching a folder against her chest as though it might slip from her hands at any moment. She introduced herself as Vivian Marsh, Reginald Kane's assistant of nearly 6 years, and explained, her voice trembling slightly, that she could no longer stay silent about what she had discovered while organizing his private files the week before. Vivian explained that she had come across a locked drawer in Kane's office left briefly unsecured during an office renovation, and out of curiosity more than suspicion at first, she had looked inside. What she found had haunted her ever since. Financial records, meticulously hidden behind layers of shell entities, showed Kane had been quietly siphoning funds from the company for well over a decade, small enough amounts scattered across enough accounts to avoid detection during routine audits, but substantial enough, added together, to amount to tens of millions of dollars. Sarah took the folder carefully, laying its contents across the desk between them, and within minutes, both she and Franklin understood they were looking at far more than simple embezzlement. Buried among the financial records was something else entirely, something that stopped Franklin's breath the moment he saw his son's handwriting on a printed internal memo dated only weeks before David's death. David had discovered the fraud himself, months before the accident, and had confronted Kane privately about it, promising in writing that he intended to bring everything to his father's attention. This was the piece that reframed everything Franklin thought he understood about the final months of his son's life. David had not died over some random, senseless accident. He had died trying to protect the company his father had built from decades of quiet theft carried out by the man Franklin trusted above everyone else. The distance Franklin remembered feeling from David in those final weeks, the quiet, careful conversations, the moments David seemed distracted or withdrawn, none of it had been estrangement at all. It had been his son gathering courage and evidence alone, trying to shield his father from a betrayal he had not yet found the right way to reveal. Vivian pulled one final item from the folder, hands shaking slightly as she handed it over, a sealed letter addressed directly to Franklin in David's unmistakable handwriting, dated the week before his death. She explained that she had found it tucked behind the financial records, and that as far as she could tell, it had never been delivered, intercepted instead within Kane's office before it ever reached Franklin's desk. Franklin stared at the envelope for a long moment before finally breaking the seal, his hands unsteady in a way that had nothing to do with the cold this time. Sarah offered to leave the room, sensing this was not something meant to be read in front of anyone else. But Franklin asked her to stay, needing, in that moment, another person present as he finally understood the truth his son had been trying to tell him for 3 years. The letter began simply, David explaining that he had found something troubling within the company and intended to bring it to his father directly once he had gathered enough proof to make the accusation impossible to dismiss. He wrote that he did not want to worry Franklin without solid evidence in hand, and that he was closer than he had let anyone else know. Further down the page, David's tone shifted entirely, moving from the fraud investigation towards something far more personal. He wrote that he had been keeping one more secret from his father, though this one, he said, brought him nothing but joy. Maya was expecting their first child, and David wanted nothing more than for his father to finally meet her properly, to put aside old disagreements about trajectory and background, and come together as a family for Christmas that year, the way David had always believed they eventually would. Franklin read those final lines 3 times before he could fully absorb them, the reality settling over him with a weight unlike anything he had carried in the 3 years since David's funeral. His son had reached out to him at the exact moment Franklin had assumed distance had grown between them, asking for reconciliation, sharing news that should have been the happiest of Franklin's life. That reconciliation had been stolen from both of them, deliberately, by the very man who had stood beside Franklin at the funeral offering condolences while knowing exactly what he had taken. The letter closed with a single line that broke something loose in Franklin that grief alone had never fully reached. David wrote that if anything ever happened to him, he trusted his father to take care of Maya and their child the way David always wished someone had taken care of Franklin himself, long before either of them had ever needed protecting from anything at all. Franklin sat in silence for a long time after finishing the letter, understanding now that he had spent 3 years grieving a son he believed had died by accident, never once realizing he was grieving a son who had died trying to protect him. Franklin did not speak for nearly 10 minutes after finishing the letter, sitting perfectly still while Sarah and Vivian waited quietly, understanding instinctively that no words they could offer would soften what he had just learned. When he finally looked up, something in his expression had changed permanently, grief giving way to a resolve neither woman had seen in him before. He asked Vivian, gently but firmly, if she would be willing to testify to what she had found, understanding fully what that request would cost her professionally and personally. Vivian, hands still trembling, nodded, saying quietly that she had spent 6 years watching Cain smile his way through meetings while men like David paid the price for his greed, and she could not carry that silence any longer. Patricia joined them the following morning, and together the four of them spent an entire week building a case methodical enough to withstand any challenge Cain might attempt once confronted. Sarah cross-referenced every financial record against Vivian's documents, tracing the embezzlement trail back through more than a decade of quietly falsified reports. Patricia, drawing on her own years running daily operations, identified additional irregularities that had gone unnoticed by outside auditors, familiar enough with company systems to know exactly where Cain had hidden his tracks. Franklin, for the first time in years, found himself working alongside his daughter as an equal partner rather than a distant, distracted figurehead, something neither of them acknowledged aloud but both quietly recognized as significant. Late one night during that week of preparation, Patricia found her father still awake in his study, surrounded by paper, and instead of simply delivering an update, she sat down across from him the way she had not done since she was a teenager. She told him, quietly, that some part of her had spent 3 years angry not just at Cain, whom she had not yet suspected, but at her father, for retreating so completely into grief that he had left her to carry the company alone without ever once asking how she was holding up. Franklin listened without defending himself, and when she finished, he simply said he was sorry, plainly and without excuse, the first apology of its kind she had ever received from him. They decided against a private confrontation this time, having learned from Franklin's earlier conversation with Cain just how easily the man could manufacture calm reassurance when caught off guard alone. Instead, they arranged for a full board meeting, ensuring every major stakeholder in the company would be present when the evidence was finally laid out. Franklin insisted on being the one to present it himself, needing, in some way he could not fully explain even to Patricia, to be the one who finally said his son's name out loud in the room where the truth would finally surface. The morning of the meeting arrived cold and clear, sunlight cutting sharply through the tall windows of the executive boardroom as members filed in, unaware of what was about to unfold. Cain arrived last, as he often did, offering his usual easy smile and casual greetings to colleagues around the table, entirely unprepared for what waited for him. Franklin let the meeting proceed through its normal agenda for several minutes, watching Cain grow visibly more comfortable with every passing moment, before finally standing and asking everyone's attention for a matter he described only as deeply personal and long overdue. He began by speaking about David, allowing himself, in front of the entire board, to speak openly about his son's death for the first time in 3 years, describing the accident everyone in the room had heard about, but never truly understood. Then, methodically, he laid out everything Sarah and Vivian had uncovered, the falsified reports, the shell companies, the traffic footage revealing a second vehicle that had never been mentioned in any official account, and finally, David's own internal memo confronting Cain about the fraud weeks before his death. The room fell into a silence unlike anything Franklin had ever experienced in over 3 decades of running the company. Every eye slowly turned toward Kane, whose easy smile had disappeared entirely, replaced by something far more desperate as he realized exactly how much evidence sat assembled against him. He attempted, briefly, to dismiss the accusations as some kind of misunderstanding, but Vivian's testimony, delivered calmly despite her nerves, and the financial documents Patricia laid out in precise detail, left no room for doubt among anyone present. Kane's composure finally shattered completely when Franklin read aloud the final lines of David's letter, the words meant for a father, never intended for a boardroom, now serving as the clearest possible evidence of exactly what Kane had taken from him. Kane's justification, when it finally came, was uglier than anything Franklin had prepared himself to hear. He admitted, in a voice stripped of all its former charm, that he had genuinely believed he was protecting everything the two of them had built together over 25 years, that David's discovery threatened to unravel decades of careful work, and that he had only intended to frighten his son into silence that night, never truly meaning for anyone to die. The confession, however partial, was enough. Security was called before Kane had even finished speaking, and authorities were notified within the hour. Franklin watched, feeling nothing resembling satisfaction, only a hollow, exhausted relief, as Kane was escorted out of the headquarters he had helped run for over 2 decades, walked past employees who had once respected him deeply, none of whom moved to defend him now. Patricia, standing beside her father throughout the entire ordeal, was appointed permanently to lead the company that same afternoon, not as consolation, but because everyone in that room understood she had more than earned the position through years of quiet dedication her father had rarely acknowledged until now. Before the board meeting concluded, Franklin did something he realized he should have done years earlier. He stood once more, this time not to expose betrayal, but to correct one of his own long-standing failures, publicly crediting Patricia for holding the company together through years of his own emotional absence, acknowledging in front of everyone present that she deserved far more recognition than he had ever given her. Patricia's expression, usually so composed and businesslike, softened for just a moment, years of quiet resentment finally meeting the acknowledgement she had stopped expecting to receive at all. Kane's arrest made headlines within days, and the case moved through the legal system faster than anyone expected, given the weight of evidence assembled against him. Franklin attended every hearing he was permitted to witness, sitting quietly in the gallery, watching a process unfold that could never fully return what had been taken from him, but that finally, after 3 years, gave his son's death a name and a reason rather than a shrug and a settled insurance claim. When Kane was ultimately convicted on charges including embezzlement and manslaughter tied directly to the events of that night, Franklin felt no triumph in the verdict, only the quiet, settled sense that the truth had finally been permitted to exist in the open. That same evening, without any lawyers or company representatives accompanying him, Franklin drove back to Queens carrying nothing but David's letter folded carefully inside his coat pocket. He knocked on Maya's door, and when she opened it, exhaustion and guarded caution still etched across her face from the eviction notice and everything else weighing on her that week. Franklin asked simply if she would allow him to read her something before she made any final decision about leaving the city. He read David's letter to her standing right there on the front steps, his voice breaking slightly over the final lines, the same lines that had broken something loose in him days earlier inside Sarah's office. Maya listened in silence, her arms slowly uncrossing as the words settled over her. Years of believing David's family had simply abandoned them, finally colliding with the undeniable truth that David had never stopped trying to bring them together, that his own father had simply never been given the chance to know. For the first time since Franklin had reappeared in her life, her expression broke completely. tears falling freely as she finally allowed herself to grieve alongside someone who understood exactly what David had meant to lose. Months passed before Franklin allowed himself to believe that everything he had rebuilt was truly steady enough to last. Patricia settled fully into her role running Coleman Aerospace Logistics, and under her direction, the company began recovering from the damage Cain had quietly inflicted over more than a decade. She and her father spoke regularly now, not just about business, but about David, about Diane, about the years they had each spent grieving separately instead of together. Their relationship would never fully erase the distance built up over so many years of misunderstanding. But something real had taken root between them, strengthened rather than broken by everything they had uncovered together. Franklin helped Maya and Elijah relocate to a modest house not far from his own home, close enough that visits became easy and frequent, though Maya had been firm about her wishes from the very beginning. She did not want Coleman money shaping her son's childhood, insisting instead that Elijah be raised the way David would have wanted, grounded and humble, regardless of the family name attached to him. Franklin respected that boundary completely, understanding finally, after everything that had happened, that love could not simply be measured in the size of a house or the weight of a bank account. Elijah started spending occasional afternoons at Franklin's penthouse, and slowly, the apartment that had felt so unbearably silent for 3 years began filling again with small, ordinary sounds, a child's questions about why the elevator needed a key, a rocket ship drawing taped crookedly to the refrigerator, laughter that no longer startled Franklin the way it once had at the cemetery, but instead settled over him like something he had been quietly starving for without realizing it. On a quiet Sunday several months later, Franklin returned once more to the cemetery in upstate New York, the same gray November sky stretching overhead, the same wind moving gently through branches that had long since grown bare again with the turning season. This time, he was not alone. Elijah walked beside him, having asked on his own to come along, curious about the father he had never known but had begun to understand piece by piece through the stories Franklin now shared freely, no longer locking his grief away in silence the way he once had. As they approached David's headstone together, Elijah reached up and took his grandfather's hand without being asked, the same easy, unguarded gesture that had startled Franklin from a distance months earlier, though now it settled over him with nothing but warmth. They stood there together in front of the grave, 3 generations somehow present in that single quiet moment, past, present, and future bound together by nothing more than shared blood and the slow, patient work of finally choosing each other. Elijah asked his grandfather to tell him about his father, the same request he had made once or twice before, though this time Franklin answered without hesitation, sharing memories he had kept locked away for years, describing David's laugh, his stubborn optimism, the way he had always believed people could change for the better if given enough patience and enough reason to try. Elijah listened closely, his father's exact eyes fixed on his grandfather with the same quiet curiosity David himself had carried as a boy, watching, learning, quietly inheriting a legacy far greater than any fortune Franklin had ever built. Franklin had spent 3 long years returning to that cemetery, believing he had lost everything that truly mattered to him, convinced that his son's death had taken with it any chance of the future he once imagined for his family. He never could have predicted that the very thing which brought him back to that hillside every single Sunday would eventually lead him toward the family he still had left, waiting quietly all along, carrying his son's eyes, his son's heart, and in time, his son's ability to teach an old man exactly how to love people the right way.